Let's look at how to solve what we call consecutive integer word problems. We're going to use the same four-step process as we use for all word problems. The sum of two consecutive mile markers on Interstate 81 in Pennsylvania is 563. Find the numbers on the markers. To think about how to solve this problem, we have to realize what we're trying to figure out. The two consecutive mile markers. These two mile markers that we're trying to determine are unknown to us. Therefore, our first unknown we will call x. That is our first mile marker. And then we need to figure out what our second unknown is, and that's our second mile marker. And since these are consecutive mile markers, it needs to be x plus 1, because it'll be the next one down the road. It's our second mile marker. Now we've defined our variables. Let's see if we can write an equation. It says that the sum of these two mile markers. So I'm going to be adding together these two mile markers, x and x plus 1. The sum of them on Interstate 81 in Pennsylvania is 563. So the sum of these two equals 563. Now I've got an equation. X plus 1 equals 563. I should now solve it. Combine like terms. And try to isolate my x variable. X equals 281. But I haven't answered the question. It wants to know, find the numbers on the markers. So I need to state both mile markers. The mile markers are 281 for my first one, and my second one is 281 plus 1, so it's 282. If I wanted to check this, I could add up my two numbers to be sure that they add up to 563, which they do. Now let's just think about different types of consecutive integers that we could see. We just did an example of consecutive integers where you're thinking about examples could be like 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if your first one is always going to be x, for consecutive integers, the next one's always one bigger, so x plus 1. The next one's 2 bigger, x plus 2. The next one is 3 bigger, x plus 3. And you could see it would go on and on like this. Let's consider how this would work with consecutive even integers. Well, examples of consecutive even integers would be 2, 4, 6, and 8. So if we're thinking about it in terms of variables, the first unknown even integer will always be x. The next one has to be 2 bigger than x. So it's x plus 2. The next one is 4 bigger, because we're counting by 2's in this scenario. The next one, 6 bigger. Now let's consider one other scenario. What if we had a problem where we were dealing with consecutive odd integers? Our first, well, some examples of consecutive odd integers could be 13, 15, 17, 19. If we're thinking about it in terms of variables, x will always be our first unknown, And then going to the next consecutive odd integer, we again have to add 2, because to count by odd numbers, we're still counting by 2s. To go from 13 to 17, we would add 4. And to go from 13 to 19, we'd have to add 6. So what you can see is that dealing with consecutive even integers and consecutive odd integer word problems will look very similar because you're still going to be using the same variables. Let's try one more scenario together. The houses on the west side of Kentucky Avenue are consecutive odd numbers. Sam and Colleen are next door neighbors, and the sum of their house numbers is 572. Find their house number. Find their house numbers. So in this scenario, X is our house number 1 that we don't know. And the next house has to be a consecutive odd number, so it's going to be X plus 2. Because we're going to use this chart and these two for our first 2 consecutive odd numbers. Now that we've defined our variables, let's see if we can write out our equation. It says that the sum of their house numbers is 572. So the sum, so I'm adding house 1 and house 2, and I know that their sum is 572. So I've got my equation. Now let's try to solve it. Combine like terms. And now I'm isolating my x variable. So x equals 285. But at this point, I need to make sure I answer their questions, because I've done 3 of my 4 parts. Defined my variables, written my equation, solved my equation. Now, step 4. Let's state our solution. Their house numbers were, or I should say are, 285 and 287, because I'm using this part and this part to figure that out. And now we've solved the problem.